to shatter the chains of the society that had rejected them. His first followers were not monsters, they were searchers. There was Lynette Squeaky Fromm, a former child dancer with a fractured home life. Soon came Patricia Krenwinkel and Susan Atkins, both young women feeling disconnected and seeking a new kind of family. He did not just offer them drugs and free love. He offered them an identity, one that revolved entirely around him. He listened to them, made them feel like the center of the universe, and slowly, expertly, began to isolate them Sebring lay dead. A long, white nylon rope was looped around each of their necks, the other end slung over a wooden ceiling beam, a detail that suggested a ritualistic hanging that was either failed or abandoned. The sheer level of violence was staggering, a frenzy that went far beyond what was necessary to kill. The term detectives would later use was overkill. This was not just murder. It was a performance of rage, a bloody spectacle designed to send a message. But what was the message, and who was it for? The initial investigation was a chaotic scramble for answers. The detectives, walking through the carnage, were baffled. The crime scene was a bizarre mix of extreme violence and strange missing pieces. There was no sign of robbery. Valuable items were left untouched. The clues they did find only deepened the mystery. A pair of horn-rimmed eyeglasses that didn't belong to any of the victims lay on the floor. The mismatched ropes suggested a level of planning, yet the frenzied nature of the stabbings 102 in total screamed of pure, unadulterated chaos. The investigators were overwhelmed, not just by the brutality, but by the sheer senselessness of it all. Their minds immediately turned to the most logical explanation they could grasp. This had to be a drug deal gone horribly wrong, a dope burn common in the LA underworld. The victims' Hollywood connections only fueled this theory. It was the only frame of reference they had for violence this extreme. They had no idea they were looking at something entirely new, something that defied all known patterns of criminal behavior, just as Los Angeles was reeling from the shock of the day. Murders, the nightmare repeated itself. The very next night, across town in the Los Feliz neighborhood, Rosemary LaBianca's son and his girlfriend arrived at his mother's home. They were concerned. They couldn't reach her by phone. As they approached the house, they noticed all the window shades were drawn, an unusual sight for a Sunday afternoon. Peering through a window, they saw Rosemary's husband, Leno, lying on the floor in a pool of blood. When the LAPD arrived at the LaBianca residence, they were met with a chilling sense of déjà vu. The scene was another explosion of savage, intimate violence. Leno LaBianca had been stabbed multiple times, and an ivory-handled carving fork was left protruding from his abdomen. In the bedroom, they found Rosemary, stabbed so many times, 41 in total, that her nightgown was stained completely red. And then there was the writing. This time the messages were more elaborate. Death to pigs and rye were scrawled in blood on the walls, and on the pristine white door of the kitchen refrigerator, a phrase that would become synonymous with the case itself, misspelled in a hurried, almost childlike hand. Helter Skelter for the investigators. The second crime scene was both a confirmation and a maddening complication. The similarities were undeniable. The extreme overkill, the bloody messages, yet the differences were just as puzzling. The killers at the LaBianca home had paused. They had showered. They had taken food from the refrigerator, leaving behind a fork and some watermelon rinds. The ability to commit such barbarity and then casually have a snack spoke of a psychological detachment that was profoundly disturbing. It was this detail, more than any other, that shattered the drug burn theory for many detectives. This was something else entirely. Yet incredibly, the investigation fractured. The Dake case was being handled by the LAPD's prestigious Hollywood division, while the LaBianca case fell to a different team in a disastrous failure of communication. The two departments did not initially connect the cases. Some in the LAPD even pushed the theory that the LaBianca murders were a copycat of the still unsolved Dake crime, a theory that sent them down a dead-end path for weeks. Meanwhile, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department was investigating the murder of Gary Hinman, a case that featured a bloody message, political biggie, and had a suspect in custody, Bobby Beausoleil. But in the bureaucratic fog, no one connected the three crime scenes. The real culprits, the Manson family, were still free, hiding in plain sight, while the city of Los Angeles held its breath, terrified of who might be next. Weeks turned into months. The leads ran cold. Hollywood was gripped by paranoia. Celebrities armed themselves, and the sense of idyllic freedom that had defined the 60s evaporated overnight. The investigation was going nowhere. Then in October, a breakthrough came from the most unlikely of sources. Susan Atkins, who had been arrested chilling, boastful detail. Atkins recounted the night at the Tate House, describing the victims' pleas, the taste of their blood, and her role in the killings. Graham, horrified, went to the authorities. Finally, the disparate pieces of the puzzle began to slam into place. The strange cult living in the desert, the Hinman murder, the Tate massacre, the LaBianca slaughter, they were all connected. The manhunt for a mysterious group of killers was over. The focus now shifted to one man, the charismatic failed musician who had orchestrated it all. The circus was about to begin when the trial of Charles Manson and his followers began on June 15, 1970. The world was watching thanks to Susan Atkins' jailhouse bragging. The prosecution knew who had committed the atrocities at the Tate and LaBianca homes. The faces of the killers were now known, but a far more important question hung heavy in the Los Angeles air. Why? What could possibly motivate a group of young people to commit such heinous, ritualistic acts of violence? The prosecutor, a sharp and ambitious lawyer named Vincent Bugliosi, knew he had a monumental challenge. His star defendant, Charles Manson, had not physically killed any of the victims in the Tate-LaBianca murders. To convict him, Bugliosi had to prove that Manson was not just a participant, but the absolute mastermind, that the others were merely extensions of his will, puppets carrying out his grand design. For that he needed a motive so powerful, so all-consuming, that it could legally bind Manson to every drop of blood that was shed, and the motive he presented was a story for the ages, a watertight narrative so terrifying and complete it would become more famous than the crimes themselves. He called it Helter Skelter. According to Bugliosi, Charles Manson was no common criminal. He was a messianic prophet of doom who believed the Beatles' 1968 White Album was a coded message speaking directly to him. He believed the lyrics foretold an impending apocalyptic race war. Manson's plan, Bugliosi argued, was to be the catalyst. He would orchestrate a series of horrific murders and stage the crime scenes to look like the work of black militants. The word pig, scrawled in blood, was a direct message intended to frame groups like the Black Panthers. This, Manson believed, would ignite the war while society tore itself apart. He and his family would retreat to a mythical bottomless pit in the desert, waiting for the chaos to subside before emerging to rule the world. It was a brilliant, terrifying narrative. It explained everything: the seemingly random victims, the savage overkill, and the cryptic messages. From a legal standpoint, it was a masterstroke. It established a clear conspiracy with Manson as the visionary, transforming him from a co-conspirator into a demonic cult leader who had so thoroughly brainwashed his followers that their hands were, in effect, his hands. The jury agreed. The Helter Skelter theory secured the convictions, and Vincent Bugliosi's subsequent book of the same name cemented the legend, making it the undisputed official gospel of the Manson case for nearly half a century. It was a perfect story, a story that convicted a killer and terrified a nation. But what if it was not the real story? What if it was just the best story? Over the decades, as journalists, investigators, and even former family members looked back, they began to pull at the loose threads of this seamless narrative, and the more they pulled, the more the entire tapestry began to unravel. The truth, they suggest, is far murkier, and the official story is plagued by contradictions that were either ignored or deliberately suppressed. The first major contradiction was the evidence on the ground. For weeks, the LAPD didn't suspect a hippie cult at all. Their primary theory, based on the celebrity victims and the underworld connections of Wojciech Frykowski, was that this was a drug deal gone catastrophically wrong into a burn of epic proportions. This theory stalled the investigation for a critical period, sending detectives down a rabbit hole of drug underworld informants. For the Helter Skelter narrative to work, Bugliosi had to downplay the family's deep involvement in drug dealing and frame them as ideological zealots. But the facts remained. The entire chain of events that led to the murders began with a drug burn involving Bernard Crowe and a subsequent murder over drug money involving Gary Hinman. This wasn't just an alternative theory. It was an inconvenient narcissist like Manson, this was the ultimate humiliation. The attack on that specific house can be seen not as the first shot in a race war, but as a poisoned arrow of revenge aimed directly at the heart of the man who rejected him. It transforms the motive from grand prophecy to petty, pathetic, rageous psychological profile that fits Manson far better than that of a political visionary. This leads to the most compelling alternative theory, one driven not by prophecy, but by pure criminal pragmatism. The timeline of fear begins with Manson shooting Bernard Crowe, convinced he's killed a Black Panther and that retaliation is coming. His sole focus becomes self-preservation. The Gary Hinman murder is then a messy necessity to get money and silence a potential witness. But when Bobby Beausoleil is arrested for it, Manson is trapped. Bobby is the only link between the family and the Hinman murder. So, what does a career criminal do? He creates a diversion. The Tate and LaBianca murders, in this light, become a horrifyingly logical, albeit insane, legal strategy. Commit a series of shocking, nearly identical copycat crimes to confuse the police and convince them that the real Hinman killer is still at large, thus exonerating Bobby. The bloody writings weren't messages to start a war. They were forensic fingerprints, deliberately planted to link the crimes together and away from the one family member already in custody. The official story begins to crumble completely when you examine the conduct of the prosecution itself. In his exhaustive book, Chaos, journalist Tom O'Neill unearthed a staggering number of procedural anomalies and potential cover-ups. He found evidence that Bugliosi may have coached key witnesses and withheld crucial interview tapes from the defense. Most disturbingly, O'Neill uncovered links between Manson and his followers and a free clinic in Haight-Ashbury run by a doctor connected to the CIA's MK-Ultra mind control program. He even documented a claim from Sharon Tate's photographer, who insisted he was notified of the murders by a CIA agent 90 minutes before the police were even called to the scene. While these deeper conspiracies remain speculative, they shatter the simple image of a rogue hippie cult. They hint at a story far more complex, one that powerful people may have wanted to remain buried. This raises the ultimate, troubling question. Was Vincent Bugliosi an objective prosecutor discovering the truth, or was he a master storyteller who, faced with a messy web of contradictory motives, drugs, revenge, copycat killings, chose to weave them all into the single, sensational, and legally airtight narrative of Helter Skelter? Did he obscure the truth to ensure the conviction of a man he knew was a monster? We are left with a profound mystery. Was this a carefully orchestrated plot to start an apocalyptic war, or a chaotic spiral of violence born from a series of small-time criminal blunders? Was Charles Manson a messiah of chaos, or just a terrified con-man trying to cover his tracks? The official story gives us a clear villain and a motive that defined an era, but the evidence left behind suggests the truth was sacrificed for a simpler legend, buried forever beneath the rubble of Helter Skelter. If we are to truly understand what happened in the summer of 1969, we have to look past the glare of the trial and the shadows of the myths. The why of this story is not found in a single, simple motive. It is found in a toxic confluence of powerful forces, a uniquely damaged predator, a group of uniquely vulnerable followers, and a society in the midst of a turbulent identity crisis. To unravel this case, we must analyze the psychology of each element and the flawed systems that allowed the tragedy to unfold. First, we must dissect the man at the center of the storm, Charles Manson. It is easy to label him a monster, a supernatural force of evil, but the truth is more clinical, and in many ways, a greater indictment of the society that created him. Manson was not born a monster. He was meticulously assembled into one by a lifetime of institutional failure. His story begins with a loveless childhood, but it was his adolescence and young adulthood spent cycling through reform schools and prisons that truly forged the weapon. These institutions meant to rehabilitate became his university. They did not teach him a trade. They taught him the mechanics of power, survival, and predation. He learned that the system was a game, and he learned how to play it better than anyone. Prison was where he studied the mechanics of manipulation, reportedly devouring books on of safety was shattered if the rich and famous could be slaughtered in there. Homes behind locked gates. Then no one was safe. A new kind of random, existential fear entered the cultural lexicon. People who had never locked their doors and suddenly bought deadbolts and guard dogs. The media, of course, was the engine for this transformation. The trial was a televised circus, and Manson, with his wild eyes and the swastika carved into his forehead, played the starring role he had always craved. He understood that he was no longer on trial for murder. He was auditioning for the role of America's boogeyman. Vincent Bugliosi's book then canonized this performance, becoming the primary historical document for millions. It demonstrates the immense power of the true crime narrative itself, its ability not just to report on a case, but to shape its definitive meaning for generations, sometimes at the expense of a murkier, more complicated truth. So finally, we are left to sift through the wreckage of these two competing realities, the myth of the Helter Skelter prophet and the grubbier reality of the paranoid con man. But perhaps the most unsettling lesson is that it does not matter which motive was primary, whether the catalyst was a Beatles song or a drug deal. The result was the same. The case forces us to confront the desire to belong, the fear of being an outcast, and the allure of simple, powerful answers to life's complex problems are not extraordinary weaknesses. They are universal parts of the human condition. The story of the Manson family is not just about a monster. It's about the societal and psychological voids that allow monsters to be created, and the terrifyingly short distance a person can travel from being lost to being lethal for half a century. We have built a legend around a devil to help us make sense of the senseless. But the truth is far more terrifying. There was no devil on those nights in August. There was only a broken man and the followers who proved that the human heart is the only bottomless pit that truly exists. So, where does this leave us? For over half a century,